Hi and welcome to this video. Today we will be talking about a very special game between no other than world champion Magnus Carlsen and Grandmaster Wesley So. In the game, Magnus he played a somewhat unusual first move. He went 1a4. Now this move hasn't been played a lot on top level, but let's see what happened. Wesley played knight f6, Magnus played knight f3, Wesley went g6, Magnus went g3. Actually all standard moves so far, except for the fact that white played this a4 move. Bishop g7, bishop g2, castles from both sides. Wesley went d5, Magnus went d4. And really, this could just be all normal theory, except for this white pawn being on a4. And after Wesley went c5, we've actually come into a sort of Catalan-Grunfeld position with reversed colors, but where black kind of got an extra tempo and went a5 instead. So after d takes c5, Magnus he decides to take the free pawn on the board, but it is not entirely free because after knight a6 there is really no good way of defending it. Magnus, if he really wanted to, he could try to play a move like bishop to e3 to protect the pawn on c5, but after knight e4 attacking the pawn again and with the bishop on g7 looking down on the pawn on b2, this would not be a good way for the position to develop for white. So instead, Magnus here, he played knight c3. He's trying to meet this move of knight e4 in advance so that the pawn on d5 would be hanging. Wesley went knight takes c5, and Magnus developed his pieces with bishop to e3. In this position, the knight on c5 is hanging, so Wesley had to either move it or protect it. Wesley decided to protect the knight with the move pawn to b6, but I have to say I actually don't quite like this move, even though the engines thinks that it's a completely fine move, because after white now plays the move a5, it seems as if the move a4 has suddenly made sense. The rook is getting open and trying to open up the a file. Wesley went bishop to b7, and here Magnus made the move bishop to d4. Now this bishop to d4 move I really like. I think it's very clever. It's just completely stopping any kind of e5 breaks that black could ever have to try to get control over the center. It's trying to get the knight into e5. It's saying that if the knight on f6 ever goes to e4, maybe white can trade bishops and the pawn on d5 could again come under attack if the knight on f3 moved. And it's just taking very, very good control over the dark squares. So instead in this position, Wesley he went pawn to e6. He's protecting the pawn on d5 a little bit more. He's trying to gain a little bit of space, maybe getting the queen to e7. And once again, Magnus making a sort of strange move. He played rook to a3. It looks really, really strange. A more normal move in this position could have been knight to e5, just taking more control over the dark squares and getting a knight into the center. But instead, rook a3. And you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of this move? The purpose is actually that he's trying to take full advantage of the fact that he played a4 on move 1. He's trying to get the queen to a1 and now put pressure down the a file after another takes on b6 at some point, which could leave the pawn on b6 weak. So he's trying to just use all of his pieces the best that he can. Wesley went queen e7 and Magnus followed up his plan of queen to a1. In this position, Wesley went knight to d7 and Magnus played knight e5, just trying to exchange these knights while at the same time opening up for the bishop on g2. We saw an exchange on e5 and then Wesley played the move bishop to c6. So Magnus he took on b6, Wesley took back, Magnus took on a8 and Wesley took back, now attacking the queen, which has to move again. So if we're trying to evaluate this position, firstly we're looking at the kings. The kings, they are pretty much equally safe, so we can't say much about this. Then we say, how is the material balance? Well, both sides, they have two bishops, a knight, a rook and a queen. And then afterwards we look at the pawn structure. The pawn structure is a little bit better for white because this pawn on b6 can be weak in the endgames. But on the other hand, black does have two central pawns where white only has one. And black's 2 pawns, they are also much closer to the center than white's are. This c2 pawn here could also prove to be a weakness later in the game, because it's not so easy to move it. He would have to move the knight first and then play c3. And that takes quite a lot of time, in which black might get more control over the center. Secondly, white's pawn breaks aren't so easy to get. The e4 pawn break is not very easy. Firstly, the pawn is hanging. Secondly, you always have to calculate whether or not black can go d4. And firstly, he also has to take care of the queen. In this position, Magnus played queen to d1, moving the attack queen away. And Wesley here played bishop f8. The point of this move is to just avoid trading the dark squared bishops. He wants to move this knight so that he can later push the pawns into the center, get some more control over the dark squares. But here, when white takes on g7 and black takes back, these dark squares, they can prove to be very weak, and this light squared bishop might be a lot better than this light squared bishop here on c6. So instead of playing knight d7 first, Wesley went bishop to f8. In this position, Magnus went queen d3. We can see that black has a little bit more space, the pawns are further advanced, and the white pawns, they are, well, there's only one which has crossed the second line. Now Wesley continued his plan, played knight to d7, the bishop is attacked, so Magnus moved it to d4, and then Wesley's trying to use all his pieces, getting the queen to b4, attacking the pawn on b2. Magnus decided to defend his pawn with rook to b1, and Wesley now playing rook to c8. He's taking the rook away from the open file because he thinks there's much more potential on the c file, especially because of the pawn on c2. It was a blitz game, and in this position Magnus did something that he doesn't usually do. He actually blundered in this position. But we can quite quickly understand the blunder when we look at it, because he played knight d1. Knight d1 is a very, very passive move. It's taking the knight away from the center. His plan with this move was to play c3 to say that he's much more safe on the queen side than he was before. Then afterwards he wants to reroute the knight. The knight can go a few different places. My guess is that he wanted to go to e3 and to g4 to look at the dark squares around the king and to take control over the square on e5. But he simply just didn't have time for this, because after the move bishop to b5, now Wesley is both looking at the pawn on e2 and the pawn on c2, and there is no way to protect them both. The queen would be hanging on d2, so it can't go there to protect them. Instead, Magnus, he went to e3 to look at the pawn on b6, but after rook takes c2, Magnus could here try to take the pawn on b6 after bishop takes b6, knight takes b6 and queen takes b6, but it wouldn't help him much. The pawn on e2 is still attacked. Sometimes there's some queen e1 checks and the white position is just falling apart. Black has the bishop pair as well. Instead, Magnus, he tried to kind of trap the rook here on c3 by attacking the queen on b4 also. The queen went to c5, Magnus played bishop f1, and finally, after all this time, black took the center, got the pawn to e5. Magnus probably should have tried to take the pawn on e5 with bishop takes e5, and after knight takes e5, queen takes e5. The material count is even so far, but d4 and the endgame which would arise after queen takes c5 and b takes c5 just isn't good for white at all. Here black has the bishop pair, much more activity with the rook on the second rank. The pawn on e3 is attacked, and this would be a very, very depressing position to play. Instead, Magnus, he took the queen on c5 with queen takes c5, bishop takes c5 and e3, trying to exchange some more pieces in this position. Wesley played bishop takes f1 and then king takes f1. But now black just has this huge majority in the center, and Wesley could even create a pass pawn with the move d4. E takes d4 was played, e takes d4 he took back. The bishop went to e1, it didn't have any other places to go. Knight e5, Wesley is bringing all his pieces into the game. Attacking the bishop on b4 and bishop to b6 was played. Magnus tried to stop the pawn on d4 a little bit more by going rook to b3, but this just weakened the first rank after rook to c1, knight to d2, d3, and here Magnus resigned. The point is that Wesley now wants to go d2, which would take advantage of the pin. The king can't move because then the bishop is hanging. And if Magnus decides to take the pawn with knight takes d3, then after knight takes d3, rook takes d3, and bishop takes b4, there is no way for white to avoid exchanging all the pieces and going into a lost pawn endgame. Here, rook e3, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, bishop takes e1, king takes e1. There is not a lot of pieces on the board, but black has this outside pass pawn, which would win him the game. And that is the game between Magnus and Wesley, where Magnus decided to play the move 1a4. It ended up backfiring, but it actually wasn't because of the opening that he lost. It was this blunder with the move knight to d1, but it's blitz chess, that happens, and it's just great to see such fighting and such creativity even on the highest levels.